They clothe themselves best they can. Fig leaves. Verse 7, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. The last thing said about this is in verse 21. Let's get that in and then we can put it all together. Verse 21 of chapter 3. The Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skins and clothed them. Now, what are we to make of this? Adam and Eve make an effort to clothe themselves with leaves. That's a sinful coping. They just sinned, they're going to cover. They've just broken with God. We know this is sinful because they're on their way away from God. They're trying to hide from God. They not only lost relationship, they lost their head. Hide from God? That's stupid. But they're trying. Sinful people try all kinds of stupid things. So we know that they're on a flight from God, and the first manifestation of the flight is, we're going to cover ourselves here. We've got to improve the situation because we just messed up big time, and their first way of improving it is clothing. Best they could do anyway. They're trying to solve the gap between what they are and what they're supposed to be, and they've so broken it. This effort on their part was, from their standpoint, the origin of hypocrisy. It was the first attempted and totally unsuccessful snow job toward God. So what in the world is God doing to improve on it? I mean, if their attempt to fix it is clothing, and thus clothing is part and parcel of hypocrisy and concealment, what's God doing stepping up and saying, I can do better than leaves. I'll give you skins. What's that? Is he aiding and abetting their hypocrisy? Affirming their pretense and their posturing, their flight from reality? Is he saying, yes, that's a good thing to do. Clothing conceals the reality. Let's do that. I don't think so. So what's he doing? The way I would put it is he's doing something that can be expressed negatively, and he's doing something that can be expressed positively. So let me just state each of those, and we'll be done. Negatively, there's a chasm here between what you are, Adam and Eve, and what you ought to be. Covering yourself with clothing is a right response, but not to conceal the truth, but confess the truth. There's the difference. They wanted to use clothing to try to conceal, like running behind a tree to hide from God. They're going to conceal. And God says, no. Clothing is the right response here because you have lost your innocence. But what clothing confess now is the gap between what you were and what you ought to be. Clothing is a declaration. I am not what I ought to be. I have lost my original glory. And clothing doesn't conceal that, it confesses that. Here's a practical implication of that. Public nudity today is not a return to innocence. It's rebellion against moral reality. God ordains clothing to witness to the glory that we lost. And to take them off in public is added rebellion. Let me take the application just a tad further. I think there's going to be a sermon on clothing somewhere down the line. I can just see it because I've got all kinds of texts here, like 1 Timothy 2:9 and 1 Peter 3:5. The Bible cares about clothing and what they say, what they mean, what they have to do with God. So here's a second application. These are like little foretastes of a month out, maybe. Those who keep their clothing on and thus don't rebel in that way, but begin to use clothing for the very opposite of what they're meant to do, namely witness to a lost glory, and begin to use them for power moves and getting people to look at you and like you more, are rebelling in the other direction. Here's a rule of thumb. Clothing does not exist. It should not be worn in order to attract attention to what it covers. It can be done with, I'm not going to go there. It's not in the manuscript. Save it. Instead, positively, clothing is meant to attract attention to what is exposed. Hands that serve each other. If you're in a warm climate, feet that take the gospel to where it needs to go. And in all climates, faces that are radiant with the glory of God that you've seen in the gospel. If you don't dress to draw attention to your face, your hands, and your feet, I know all you women like to draw attention to your feet because you wear red nails. But I wonder, I keep getting ahead of myself here. That's the negative thing. The positive. We've already crossed over into the positive for clothing. The positive meaning of clothing is that God had in mind not just to witness with clothing to a lost glory, but to witness to the fact that He's going to fix it someday. He's going to overcome the chasm someday that exists between what we ought to be and what we are. Clothing means that. It's not only a witness or a confession to our failure, it's a testimony to our future glory. God rejected their own self-clothing. And then He clothed them in mercy. We know that mercy is flowing here because in 3:15, the serpent is going to be hammered. And so He moves on down to 3:21, and He clothes them with skins way better. They had no idea how to make clothing. And He makes them clothing. Mercy is flowing here. Mercy that says, one day you will find yourself in relationships where naked and not ashamed makes sense again. One day you will find yourself in relationships with me as your God in which you don't need to be ashamed anymore because of what my Son does. I won't ever make you feel ashamed. For all your sin, I will pass over, and I will clothe you with my righteousness, and I will clothe you with my glory, and you will shine like the stars in heaven and like the sun on a blazing day. That's what clothing means. Which is why you keep it simple, lest it take the place of His glory. So our clothing is a witness to our failure and our future glory. They testify to the chasm between what we are and what we ought to be, and they testify to God's merciful intention to bridge the chasm through Jesus Christ and His death. And that perhaps is why blood had to be shed.